Here at 93.5, 1590 WAKR. Hear that? We're going to go back in time, a little rock and roll, little movie industry success going back to the early 1970s. We are going to bring in our film study professor. We're going to film school today with my good friend Joe Fortunato today as we go back to the 1973 movie American Graffiti. And I've been mentioning throughout the morning, Joe, this movie launched many careers. It certainly spun off television ideas, and it was an iconic film. A lot of people forget that it was an Academy Award nominated film when you go back to 1973. But my friend Joe, you take it from there. American Graffiti.
Well, good morning, Ray, and thanks for having me, as usual. Yeah, today we're asking the cinematic question, where were you in 62? Because that is exactly the tagline they used to market this film. And we are talking American Graffiti, released August 11th, 1973, directed by George Lucas. This is a film a lot of people forget that A, even exists, or that George Lucas directed before Star Wars. So he had a hit with this movie. I'll talk about that in just a second. It was written by George Lucas as well as his good friends Gloria Katz and Willard Hayek. As you mentioned, it had 5 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actress for Candy Clark, Best Screenplay, and Editing. Didn't win any, but it did have 5 nominations. And in 2007, the American Film Institute ranked it as the 62nd greatest movie of all time, which is kind of ironic since we said, where were you in 62? For those who aren't familiar, this is sort of a coming-of-age film. It happens all in one night on the last day of their high school graduation. A group of teenagers in California, on their final night, are just cruising the strip with their buddies before they go off in their different directions as would-be adults. And I really look at this film as sort of a predecessor for coming-of-age films like Fast Times at Ridgemont High and then Dazed and Confused in the 90s. So kind of every 10 years or so, there seems to be a seminal film like this that has, a group of teenagers coming of age, and not dissimilar to those other films I mentioned. There was an amazing cast here, all unknowns at the time, and most of them went on to great stuff in either film or television or both.
When you talk about the cast, a couple of the players in the cast that had itsy-bitsy roles were Harrison Ford and Suzanne Summers. But, Joe, to your point, launching careers, and why don't you go down that road?
Yeah, well, we usually talk about casting and who might have been, and there really wasn't a whole lot for this because, like I said, they were all kind of unknowns. Harrison Ford initially turned down the film because he was only offered $485 a week, which was less than he earned as a carpenter. So it wasn't enough to support his family. When they upped the offer to $500, he accepted the film. Actually, Mark Hamill auditioned for a part. Of course, he would later become Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. He didn't make it, but that's a what might have been kind of a thing. The Wolfman Jack, who has a cameo playing himself in the movie, was specifically chosen by George Lucas because Lucas remembered listening to him when he was on the radio when Lucas was in high school. So there's a number of fun cast stories. One sort of misconception about the film, and I'll talk about this with Ron Howard, who is cast as Steve, in the role of Steve. A lot of people think that Happy Days, the television show, was a direct result of the success of American Graffiti, when actually that's not true, because Happy Days, the pilot, was filmed before American Graffiti. So it actually ended up, not to go off on a whole tangent here, but it actually ended up being a part of an a Love American style segment before American Graffiti. Now, the other connection to Happy Days is that when they did create the show Happy Days, the producers wanted to have sort of a quote-unquote greaser character like Paul Lamatt's John Milner in American Graffiti, so they created the fonts. So there is a connection between the two films, but one didn't necessarily lead to the other, as a lot of people assume.
And, of course, with the Happy Days, also Cindy Williams, who went on to be Shirley Feeney, I think, in Laverne and Shirley, and Happy Days was also in the movie. But, boy, I was talking about this earlier this week with my wife when we talked about American Graffiti. What a string there in launching Richard Dreyfuss at this time of his career, right, Joe? He had this one, he had Goodbye Girl, he had Jaws, all there in the low to mid-70s. He had quite a run.
Yeah, he definitely did. And as we've talked about with Jaws, he didn't want to do that film, but he actually was put in contact with Steven Spielberg because of his friendship with George Lucas, and George suggested it based on working with him on American Graffiti. The film itself, by the way, they didn't think much of it. The studios didn't think much of it. In fact, they sat it on a shelf for almost 6 months before they released it. And it only cost about $750,000, so less than $1 million to produce. It eventually grossed over $115 million, and that actually makes it one of the most profitable movies ever made. From the low budget to what it actually made.
That's interesting, and I had that on my list of things to bring up to you because I saw the dollars of the profitability of the movie American Graffiti. Did they ever go back, because often you see it, and try to make a sequel to American Graffiti? Did they ever try to do that?
They certainly did, and it's the irony of that is it's sort of considered one of the worst sequels of all time. So, and I don't remember off the top of my head what year that was, but it was sort of later 70s.
All right. So American Graffiti, today's film school with film study professor Joe Fortunato. If you haven't seen it in a while, might be a good look back to American Graffiti of 1973. And as Joe mentioned, where were you in 62? Joe, my friend, thanks for the visit as always. We'll catch up with you next week.
Thanks, Ray.
There you go. Joe Fortunato, Film School, WAKR.